Hi, I'm Chuck Olenek. I'm a reenactor. And for 36 years, I used to use historical reenactment to bring the subject to life for my students in the classroom. Well, I'm not doing that anymore, so I'm repurposing myself. And since I got out of the classroom, what I've been doing is taking a deep dive into California history, and I kind of want to bring it to life the same way I used to bring world history to life in my classroom, which means wearing the garb and getting the music going for the time period in the background so there's a soundtrack, and trying to make history more tangible than drawings from the time period. And at first I started with the missions and the presidios and the assistencias. Well, I got those covered Russian California as part of that series, and in my research on the missions, I kind of stumbled across a number of famous outlaws that were frequenting the missions. Well, not the actual missions, they were frequenting the saloons that were attached to the missions after they were secularized. And I came across some very famous names and I got intrigued. Well, this particular episode, I'm on the trail of Joaquin Murrieta, and I am trying to sort out the myth or the myths from the facts. And there's a lot of this stuff that's intertwined. So I hope you stick with me on this journey. To track Joaquin Murrieta, called by some the Robin Hood of the West or the Robin Hood of El Dorado, that's gold country, and to wade through his disputed historical fact and folklore, I started my search with the 1854 novel written by John Roland Ridge, The Life and Adventures of Joaquin Murrieta, the Celebrated California Bandit. But it's a dime novel, written, by the way, under the nom de plume Yellowbird, and that tends to muddy the waters as to how faithfully the details are portrayed. What Ridge, grandson of Cherokee leader Major Ridge, wrote contributed to the legend of Murrieta, and it was translated into various European languages. Parts of Ridge's novel were reprinted in 1858 in the California Police Gazette. This story was picked up and translated into French, which was translated into Spanish, and the translator took Ridge's original story and changed every Mexican reference and made it Chilean for some reason, maybe because there were a lot of Chilean miners involved in the gold rush. Although Ridge advocated for the rights of the Cherokee Nation and Mexican Americans in his writings, his ideas about race and identity were complex and often conflicted. He wasn't a believer in equality of the races, and he was descended from a family of Arkansas slave owners and opposed both abolition and the Civil War. In Joaquin Murrieta, he depicts California Indians as uncivilized cowards, and then there's the brutal massacres of passive Chinese miners by Three-Finger Jack. He also believed that more civilized native groups such as the Cherokee were worthy of the rights of and privileges of U.S. citizenship. Ridge's short novel, the first edition was published in San Francisco and it was just 90 pages long. My edition's 137. Traces Murrieta's transformation from a young Mexican immigrant into a legendary bandit and insurrectionary in a pulp novel that's filled with melodrama, bravado, daring escapes, and graphic violence. With the publication, legends popped up like weeds about a notorious outlaw in California during the California gold rush of the 1850s. And some would say that the evidence for historical Murrieta is scarce, that this is all based upon folk tales and the rampant racial prejudice between the old Californios and the Anglo-Americans who moved in seeking California gold. Murrieta gets compared to Zorro by many as he fights the good fight against oppressors of the people. Early 20th century writer Johnston Macaulay was said to have based his character Don Diego de la Vega, better known as Zorro, in his novel by the same name, on Ridge's 1854 novel about Murrieta. Zorro's first appearance
In the August 1919 issue of the pulp fiction magazine, The All Story was a 5-part serial story, The Curse of Capistrano. But here, Don Diego, the son of a Spanish landowner, is fighting a dictator. It's a bit of a change from Murrieta fighting Americans, and Murrieta's not the only source material for Zorro. Solomon Pico began his career around the same time and also fights the Anglo oppressors. He has an even better claim to being the model for Robin Hood and Zorro. He comes from a wealthy and influential family and leads a double life of a stock dealer by day and a bandido by night, and who has the loyalty of the California people who are willing to aid or hide him. Then there's Tiburcio Vasquez, who also got his start around 1852 and who managed to have a career which lasted over a score of years. And there's even Stanislao de Yokuts from Mission San Jose, a quarter of a century earlier, who led a revolt against the Mexicans. We're going to see how this version of Zorro gets his start.
It doesn't help that Joaquín Murrieta's story, there's actually a whole bunch of conflicting stories. So trying to track the man down, you have to struggle between the book that got written by Ridge and just different accounts. Pretty much they all agree he was born in Sonora and he got married to Rosa Feliz, and in 1849 he, Rosa, his brother, 2 of his half-brothers, her 3 brothers, one of whom is Claudio, who's going to become very important later in the story, and a number of cousins left Sonora, and they went to the Stanislaus placers and were working the mines there and had set up shop in the tent city that had like 5,000 tents in it. There was called the Sonoran Camp. So Joaquin was living in a small cabin with Rosa and working his claim. Miners showed up, and according to one story, they beat Joaquin, they raped Rosa, and seized his claim and drove them off. And then he is supposed to have moved north and went through exactly the same process. And what's interesting is some people seem to argue that no, the rape never happened, which was kind of an interesting thing that people would dispute something like that. But now Joaquin is going to try to pick a new path in life. Well, now the story's going to shift locale, and Joaquin and Rosa and members of their family moved north to a place in Calaveras County called Murphy's Diggings. It's now called Murphy's. And he took up mining again, but then later he kind of switched careers and he started dealing cards. And he apparently went to see, like, his half-brother borrowed a horse or a mule, which turned out to have been stolen, and his half-brother is supposed to have been lynched, but vigilante justice. And Rosa was raped again, and then Joaquin was supposed to have been severely beaten. And again, there's some discrepancies about the story, but Ridge writes about it, and other people say, okay, something really bad happened, but the half-brother might not have been the person that was lynched. There may not have even been a lynching, since lynchings were often reported in newspapers at the time. Some scholars still dispute what happened to Rosa. Some people think Joaquin was just really angry that he was beaten and publicly humiliated. Well, what's going to start happening now is people are going to start turning up dead one by one. Each of those Anglo tormentors of Joaquin is found dead, and this starts to create a panic. And so Murrieta begins his life of crime. And then the dime novelist Ridge makes this easy, self-fulfilling prediction of once he'd begun this road, there was no way he could turn back, which his life is already laid out. You know, Ridge is writing history, or at least what he's calling history. And you have to remember, the facts get very sketchy here. When Rosa was raped at Murphy's Diggings, there were some accounts that said that Rosa died in the arms of Murrieta, which sounds really dramatic, except that even Ridge was writing about her still being around in the story. So you just got to take a lot of this with a grain of salt. But Murrieta was involved in such well-organized crime. He ended up joining up with his brother-in-law, Claudio, who already had a gang, who already had been in trouble, and that when crimes started occurring in different places almost simultaneously and they were some distance apart, it was just too easy for people to say, blame Murrieta. Now, where Claudio, the brother-in-law, is, as far as he ended up taking action the very first time, it's like December of 1850, and he and 11 others ended up going into Contra, Costa County to Rancho Los Megueras, which belonged to John Marsh, and the people at the rancho were overwhelmed. There was an Anglo visitor who was shot and lanced. Marsh and his servants were tied up, and they were robbed of like $300 worth of gold and various valuables and guns. And about 10 days later, another rancho gets hit, and this time the robbers are a lot more brutal about it. As far as they killed 3 people there, and you know, we don't need to even go into like the descriptions of how and all that, but the ranch house was set ablaze, and things were discovered anyway, as primitive as investigative techniques were back then. And a story started to go around that Joaquin was doing this to fight for justice because of all the injustices that Anglos had dished out to him and to others, except that in the case of Claudio's gang, there were more than half the gang were Anglo, that were involved in the crimes. In February of 1851, just a couple of months after Claudio's gang had begun their, spree, they decided to attack the rancho of a native Californio. And again, this messes with the theory of these guys were acting as Robin Hoods and they were fighting against the Anglos. By the way, the attack on the rancho didn't work out at all. The owners saw them coming. The vaqueros were well armed. They chased off the banditti. And now the gang is going to switch tactics. Now they're going to begin preying upon lone travelers, miners, and prospectors who were not near the towns, And a lot of times they didn't even want to get them near the camps. They wanted to isolate them, lasso them off their horses, drag them into the thickets, and their bodies would be discovered later, because the gang was pretty much sticking with the criminal adage of dead men tell no tales. Later, they're going to begin shifting when Claudio gets imprisoned. He's going to be imprisoned briefly and he'll break out. The gang is going to switch tactics, and they're going to begin stealing horses and mules in large numbers, and they're going to be driving them from the gold fields on south, and they're going to be selling them to the Mexican army. Okay, so it turns out there's more to talk about Joaquin than is going to fit in one video. So I hope you stick around.